Hey there, music lovers. Welcome to the channel. Thanks so much for dropping by. In this video, I wanted to talk about the set list that the Electric Light Orchestra is doing this summer on their US tour. This is their first tour in many, many years. I think it's about 30 years. ELO, what is ELO nowadays? It's even called technically Jeff Lynne's ELO. And there's a very good reason for that. I mean, really, it's always been Jeff Lynne's band, depending on how you take a look at things. In terms of playing live, ELO's heyday was in the 70s. And if you go back and look at footage of that band playing in the 70s, it was very much like a band, very, very raw. You had Bev Bevan on drums and Richard Tandy on keyboards, and you had the guys there with the violins and all that stuff, and it sounded like a rockin' band. Even though Jeff Lynne is the one that wrote everything, So in the studio, it was really Jeff Lynne's baby. On the road, it was a different story. It was very, very raw. And of course, that kind of changed as we got closer to the 80s. It really became more of a Jeff Lynne thing, especially as people started dropping off. And then probably, around 1983 is when ELO lost their relevancy. I mean, they really haven't been relevant in about 35 years. I think it was the album Secret Messages that had Rock and Roll is King. That's really the last time. They had like one album after that. They were pretty much done. They didn't come back again until 2001. Took a lot of years off. And by that time, it was the Jeff Lynne show for sure. It was basically a Jeff Lynne solo album, that album Zoom, that came out in 2001. They tried to have this big comeback. They had a PBS special concert. They had this big tour planned, and it just went over like a lead balloon. The PBS concert, I remember, was just boring. And I probably wasn't the only one who thought that, because they only sold about 700 seats the day that tickets went on sale for that tour, and they wound up canceling the whole thing. And Jeff Lynne has talked about how he just felt like it really, in retrospect, wasn't ELO's time. No pun intended. They just didn't have the retro train ready for them yet. People just were not into them at that point. Here we are now, 17 years later. And a lot has changed. There's a lot more interest now. Of course, there's a whole nother generation that's come up. People are more interested in the 70s and in the 80s. And so, plus Jeff Lynne decided, let's do this one more time. He's really more of a studio guy. He doesn't like to perform live, which is another reason why you haven't seen ELO trying to get back on the road, or even Jeff Lynne performing live a whole lot. He'll come out for these one-off type things, like he played at George Harrison's the special concert that they had for him and everything. But he's really not much of a live guy. He doesn't really care for that. And so, this is ELO's first tour in 30 years. A big resurgence in popularity for them. They just went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last year. They just sold out Wembley. They even put out a DVD for that recently called Wembley or Bust. He's got a great band working with him now. He's got like Lee Pomeroy on bass, who I've seen him with Steve Hackett. And of course, he's been playing with John Anderson and Trevor Rabin and Rick Wakeman. They're Yes featuring A or W. Of course, he's not playing with them this summer because he's out with Jeff Lynne. But, just a really tight, polished band. Definitely different than what ELO was doing in the 70s. And I was even watching some footage from that Wembley or Bust, and I swear, I wouldn't be shocked if Jeff Lynne did a ton of overdubs too. There was one video that I saw where he wasn't even standing near the microphone, and you could hear him singing great. So something's going on there. And knowing that Jeff Lynne is a studio guy, a perfectionist, there's probably a lot of tweaking going on before these DVDs come out. But my whole take with ELO is just that, as much as I love ELO's studio work, and I think they've got a lot of great classic tracks, ELO live nowadays, to me, kind of comes off as a bit dull. The band is way too polished. Jeff Lynne is not a very exciting frontman. He kind of has this monotone voice. He doesn't command a crowd or anything. He just stands up there and plays. The music is great on the albums, great on the radio, but it's not really like fist-pumping music or really like energetic type of music. It's not, ELO is not really known for their muscle. It's like classical pop music. And I found myself watching ELO live from that Wembley DVD, and it's just like, all right, after 5 or 6 minutes, it's just like, so what? I don't know. That's just my take. I know that might sound harsh, but it doesn't really grab me. Whereas I could go watch the 70s stuff, and that's just a lot more rocking. That seems a lot more raw. I guess it just depends on what you're looking for. Also, ELO to me is one of these bands where I think their greatest songs are the ones that you heard on the radio. I think that their greatest hits represents the best of what ELO has to offer. I don't think they're one of these bands with like a lot of great, deep, classic cuts that you just got to hear, you know. A few exceptions maybe. There is one song called Fire on High that I really, really like. That's like an acoustic-driven instrumental track that you should check out. And there might be a couple of others, but for the most part, I think the best ELO, you've probably heard it. That being said, though, let's get into the set list that ELO played just a few nights ago on August the 2nd in Oakland at the Oracle Arena. I'm just going to run through the set list and give my thoughts on some of these tunes. All right, so they get things started with this song called Standing in the Rain, which is this deep cut from the Out of the Blue album. And I never really cared for that song a whole lot. And then they do Evil Woman, which of course is this great pop classic. This is one of those songs that came about quickly. Jeff Lynne was looking for a hit, and it was the last song to be written for that album, and he just knocked it out in like 5 or 6 minutes. All Over the World is after that. You may recall that's from the Xanadu soundtrack. That movie was a major, major flop. It came out in 1980. It had like Olivia Newton-John was in it. It was Gene Kelly's final film. You know, he was like this real popular, you know, singer, dancer, actor too. And for that soundtrack, Olivia Newton-John got the first side and ELO got the second side. And ELO didn't actually have a bad album there. They also had this other hit called I'm Alive. Then they do Showdown, which is like this real funky song from 1973. It's one that actually John Lennon really liked. He used to call ELO Son of Beatles. That was his way of putting it. ELO was definitely influenced by the Beatles, no question about it. And what's interesting is that Jeff Lynne got to work with them in one way or another. He never got to work with John Lennon, but he did get to work with a demo that he had many, many years later, and I'll get to that in just a bit. Then they do this song called Do Ya, which is a song that The Move had recorded originally. That was a band that Jeff Lynne was in before ELO. ELO actually re-recorded Do Ya because so many people thought that it belonged to someone else named Todd Rundgren. He was playing it live in his band at that point in the early 70s, and everybody thought it was a Rundgren song. And so when ELO was interviewed, you know, asked, you know, what they thought about this Rundgren song called Do Ya, Jeff Lynne was like, maybe we should re-record it to reestablish who really owns that song. So I always thought that was kind of interesting. Then they do this song called When I Was a Boy, which is from the most recent ELO album called Alone in the Universe. And, you know, like I said earlier, it's really a Jeff Lynne solo album. I'm not a fan of it. Don't really care for that song. I think it's kind of boring. So up next, we get Handle with Care, which is this track that, of course, Jeff Lynne recorded with the Traveling Wilburys. And that could actually be a whole nother video talking about this era in Jeff Lynne's career when he was working with the likes of George Harrison and Tom Petty and Bob Dylan. And Roy Orbison. He went on to produce albums by all those guys. And, you know, this is when Jeff was taking off as a producer. And I've always found his production to be kind of a mixed bag. The pros of his production is that he was very successful with it. I mean, look at what he did with Full Moon Fever with Tom Petty. Look at what he did with George Harrison's solo album, Cloud 9, the one that had, you know, like Got My Mind Set on You. He produced Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers album, Into the Great Wide Open, which was very, very popular. And so the cons of his production is the sound. Like, everything sounds the same. Like, the drums sound the same. There's a particular drum sound that you get when you have Jeff Lynne producing your albums. Like when he did that Tom Petty album, Into the Great Wide Open, Stan Lynch's drums sounded like Ringo Starr. Like it sounded like every other thing that Jeff Lynne has ever done. And I guess, you know, do with that what you like. I'm kind of, you know, interested to hear what you guys think about Jeff Lynne as a producer. You know, he just produced Bryan Adams' last album, and it sounds like an ELO album, you know, like without the strings, like the drums. It sounds very much like a Jeff Lynne thing. And I always like it when a producer kind of takes your sound and brings the best out of you, not imposes his sound on you. So it's almost like when you say, hey Jeff, I want you to produce my album, you're basically saying, I want my album to sound like ELO, because that's what it basically winds up sounding like. So put your thoughts about that below. I'm really interested to hear about that. After that, we get this song called Rockaria, I think is how you say it. It's this studio version of this song has a screw up. It starts off with this operatic singer, and she screws up the very, very beginning of it, and she says, oops, and then she kicks right back into it. I thought that was cool how they kind of left that in. I'm not really crazy about that song, though. Then they do Can't Get It Out of My Head, which, of course, that was ELO's real big break. That was their first top 10 hit that they got at the end of 1974. That's a pretty cool tune. Always did like that one. Then they follow it up with the, you know, 10538 Overture, however you want to say that. That song, I never really cared about that. That's really about this escaped prisoner. And that's why they got the number at the beginning of this particular song title, is because it's about this escaped prisoner. And it wasn't a hit, and this is a classic example. I just don't find it interesting. Then they follow it up with Xanadu, which is the you know, title track from that soundtrack. And this was the song where ELO and Olivia Newton-John kind of did their duet. And I never really cared for this song, to be honest with you. Although it was a pretty decent hit for him. After this, they do Shine a Little Love from the Discovery album, which is probably my favorite ELO album. I remember when that album came out in '79, I was loving that album. I mean, that's the one that had like Don't Bring Me Down and Confusion, and what else was on that album? Last Train to London was on there. I just liked that album. That album just really pops and just has a lot of, you know, great melodies. This is also an example of how, you know, I've heard the live version of Shine a Little Love, and it just does not stack up to the studio version. It doesn't do it justice. The studio version just has so much more life to it that the live version, to me, just doesn't really, it doesn't shine, I guess you can say. After that, they do Wild West Hero, which is a deep cut from Out of the Blue. You may recall they started off with a deep cut from Out of the Blue, and just like that one, I don't care about it. Then they do Sweet Talking Woman, which was originally called Dead End Street, but they didn't want to sound like the Kinks, because the Kinks had a song called Dead End Street, so they changed it to Sweet Talking Woman. And what was interesting about this song is I think this song was ripped off by Huey Lewis many years later. Huey Lewis, his first big hit was a song called Do You Believe in Love? You may recall that. And that song was actually written by Robert Mutt Lang, who was, of course, the classic producer. He's the one that produced like Back in Black. He produced Def Leppard, you know, Pyromania, Hysteria. He produced Bryan Adams and a bunch of other people, The Cars. Anyway, he wrote Do You Believe in Love for Huey Lewis. And I always thought that song sounded just like Sweet Talking Woman. Go back and listen to it. I'll try to put a link to it below so you can check them both out. To me, it's a blatant rip. There was nothing ever done about it legally. Huey Lewis got his lumps, though, later when Ray Parker Jr. ripped him off. And I talk about that in this video that I did about Huey Lewis. I'll put a link up to that. But basically, Ray Parker Jr. wrote this song called Ghostbusters for the film. And he was sued by Huey Lewis because it was a ripoff of I Want a New Drug. And so I'll try to put that down there below too if you want to hear that. So up next they do Telephone Line, which what's interesting about this song is Jeff Lynne actually, he was in Europe at the time that he was writing this song, and he actually called the US just to hear the ringtone so it could inspire him in how to write the song. I thought that was interesting. He didn't get sued for that though. Then they do Don't Bring Me Down, which of course is one of their biggest hits from the Discovery album. Always did love that song. And that's a song that Jeff Lynne actually not only wrote himself, but he practically played every instrument on it. He started off with the drums, and then he just started to like layer stuff on top of it, played it for the rest of the guys in the band, and they all loved it. And they were like, yeah, Jeff, sure, whatever is going to get me to the bank so I can cash that check. Then they do Turn to Stone, which is a great track. Finally, a great track from the Out of the Blue album. Too many album cuts. Turn to Stone, I always loved that song. That's a really cool song there. And then they close out the show with Mr. Blue Sky, which I always thought was like one of the biggest Beatles influenced songs. It kind of reminds me of like A Day in the Life, the way it kind of starts and everything. This is a song that Jeff Lynne was having trouble writing. It was kind of real dreary. And then I remember in this interview, he talked about how the sun came out, and he just kind of followed the inspiration of the sun coming out, and it just kind of opened up this whole, can of ideas for him. And he wound up writing the song, which I think is really beautiful. Just the way it kind of just unfurls. I think it's a classic song. It's got to be one of the best songs that ELO has ever done. And like I said earlier, he didn't get to work with John Lennon, unfortunately, because he passed in 1980, but he did get to produce all of the Beatles in one way or another. Of course, he produced George Harrison. He produced Ringo Starr. He also even he produced, I think, Flaming Pie by Paul McCartney. And the remaining Beatles got together, you may recall, and they found this demo that John Lennon had recorded, like this vocal demo, and they put together this song called Free as a Bird. And so Jeff Lynne produced that. So he actually got to produce the Beatles technically. Of course, it wasn't all four of them, the original band, as you would love to do, but he did get to put his stamp on the Beatles. And yeah, he was able to make the Beatles sound like ELO. So kind of a good way to end everything here. Like I said, no matter what Jeff Lynne does, it's always going to sound like ELO. And so kind of interesting how he was inspired by the Beatles, and then he wound up putting his stamp on them. And anyway, Jeff Lynne closes out the show with Roll Over Beethoven, which is like one of the first songs that ELO ever really did. Was never really crazy about it, but that's how they end the show. I thought that, overall, it's a good set list for ELO. I mean, there's not much else you could really do. I mean, there might be a few other songs that you could have thrown in here. I would have liked to have seen, like Last Train to London would have been cool, or Fire on High, of course, but that's probably asking way too much. Or what about Twilight? I would have loved to have heard that. Although I've heard them do Twilight, I think it's on the Wembley or Bust DVD, I think. It just doesn't stand up to the studio tracks. And I'll just kind of circle back around to what I said. I love ELO. I think they've got some really good songs. But to me, ELO live currently, it's just not as exciting and not as mind-blowing as I would like. I don't think that the live versions capture the studio magic quite the same. And I think that the best versions of these songs are on the albums that they came from. But that's just my opinion. I want to know what you think. What do you think about ELO live? Would you go see them now? If you are going to go see them, there's not too many chances. And who knows when they'll come back around again. As I said, Jeff Lynne does not like to play live. He's more of a studio guy. But if you're going to go check him out, definitely find a city close to you in the month of August, all right? Let me know what you think about this set list. Would you go see ELO? What do you think of them live? Give this video a thumbs up. If you like it, be sure to hit subscribe too, and I will talk to you later.